Good afternoon and welcome back. My name is Carolyn Evans. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of Griffith University, and welcome to the after lunch session. In a dark room where nobody up here can see if you're not off, we have put on a cracker of a session for you to make sure that we can keep you awake in that post-afternoon slump. This might sound like an obscure topic at the start, autonomy and university regulation, and yet I think it is fundamental to our understanding of universities, but perhaps under-discussed and not well thought through in Australia. The autonomy of universities is something that goes back a long way in our history. Medieval universities weren't autonomous in the sense that we think about them, but because of their close relationship with the church, they had a degree of independence from the states. And as modern universities began to arise from the writings of people like Wilhelm von Humboldt, we see university autonomy becoming central. In his words, it's universities, to be great universities, have the right to fully exercise and practice academic freedom and self-government with regard to internal activities. These ideas were influential not only in Germany, but across the world, including in the United States. And it is perhaps the separate opinion of Justice Frankfurter in the US Supreme Court's celebrated Sweezy versus New Hampshire decision that is the summary, a pithy summary of what university autonomy is about. He says, the dependence of a free society is on free universities, and pointedly remarked, this means the exclusion of governmental intervention in the intellectual life of a university. Now, university autonomy has always been contested. No dictatorial government sleeps easily at night without universities being safely under their thumb. Yet even in Western countries which birthed the idea of autonomy, there's been a decided swing towards greater and greater interference with universities. So, we're going to hear today from the United Kingdom, so I won't comment about that. Some of this is quite hostile. In the United States, for example, the American Council of Education has noted that since 2021, there's been a wave of bills, 140 from 40 different states in 2022 alone, seeking to restrict teaching and training. It is a deliberate attempt to try and chill certain sorts of speech on campus with threats of punishment that includes fines, loss of state funding, civil liability, termination, even criminal charges against teachers. Now, Australia has probably never had the apex of respect for autonomy that the United States has, nor has the backlash been as strong. Historian Hannah Forsyth has written a very thoughtful overview in the way of which particularly federal governments interrelated with university autonomy here. The federal government became involved in higher education in Australia during the Second World War predominantly. It was a time when everyone was agreed that the national interest required a greater degree of intervention of the government in business, in ordinary people's lives, ration cards and so forth, and in universities. It was understandable and acceptable. But very quickly we moved from the World War into a post-war world where government continued to have a degree of intervention. And we heard in the first session today reference to the Australian University Commission and its successors, and it was seen, and this is a term that's often used, as a useful buffer against government overreach. But interestingly, Forsyth notes that in cabinet papers that were released about this, Prime Minister Menzies, who was seen and was indeed a great supporter of relatively independent universities, was more cynical about its role. He argued to cabinet colleagues, money is the weapon by which oversight of universities will be secured. And AP Gallagher in a 1982 article argued the Australian Universities Commission and successors mediated the gradual but steady increase in government interference in university business. And so we come to today. Universities are regulated by every level of government. We have general legislation, some of which fits very well and appropriately at universities, some of which does not. We have specific legislation. We have formal regulation. We have agreed, cooperatively developed quasi-regulation, like the Universities Foreign Interference Task Force. The ever-increasing use of funding agreements as a source of regulatory pressure or requirements that perhaps wouldn't get through formal systems. Informal pressure from ministers, from departments, sometimes even from individuals or groups of parliamentarians who wish universities to adopt an agenda. And now we have the Accord, which does mention autonomy 8 times relevantly as universities being autonomous in the report, but also has a very detailed, very prescriptive set of visions for where the sector might go. The issues are not straightforward. Governments spend billions of dollars on universities, tens of billions of dollars indeed. They are, quite appropriately in a democracy, responsible to the people for that expenditure. Yet, as we'll hear from some of the sessions today, over time, regulation has the potential to whittle away not only autonomy, but with it diversity, innovation, and perhaps even a commitment to excellence. What is the right balance to strike? Well, fortunately, we have an expert panel to help us in these deliberations. I won't introduce them in detail because their details do appear in the program. But Adrienne Nieuwenhuis is a Commissioner of TEQSA, David Gonski, Chancellor of UNSW, and Alison Johns, Chief Executive of Advanced Higher Education, who's come to us all the way from the UK. We're going to start with a few minutes overview from each of these panellists, then we'll go to your questions or mine, preferably yours. And David, given that you're coming to us, and we hope you can hear it, yes, the smile suggests you can hear us, we might start with you if we could.
Ladies and gentlemen, firstly, thank you to UA for hosting us, and also I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm now sitting, the Gadigal people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. It is my view, as we look at the Universities Accord, and I know there's a lot of discussion there about it today and tomorrow, that we're at a once-in-a-generation opportunity to rebuild the regulatory architecture that surrounds our universities. In my opinion, as an old and very old, I might say, lawyer, regulation designed correctly can be an enormous boon to the sector. However, bad regulation reached by government to smother problems or as a short-term fix can be catastrophic. And I wanted, in the short time given to me by Carolyn, to give just 5 points that have to be, in my opinion, looked at in relation to regulation. First, I believe autonomy of our universities should not be feared. I've been around a long time, and in my view, autonomy generally pushes people and institutions to do better. It allows individuals, teams, schools, and faculties to stretch themselves, and indeed, if I may say so, to reach for the stars. Over-regulation, in my experience in large organizations, results in a reversion generally to the mean. People are too scared to do too little, which is fine, but on the other hand, don't feel they have to do more than what's expected of them. The second point I'd make is regulation should provide the framework for success. It should be tested and utilized as a tool to encourage best practice rather than used for other purposes, such as in anger or to punish. Without talking about particular people, parties, and so on, if you look at the last 10 years, a great deal of the regulation could be said to be retributive in terms of its nature. My third point is that regulation can be over-regulation where there is duplication. All of us involved as state-owned universities or whatever are well aware that there's 2 lots of regulation straight off in many situations, the federal and obviously state. And I believe we have to be very careful to make sure that universities, and indeed big institutions generally, don't find themselves tied up in the quandary of how do the 2 pieces, or maybe even 3, work together in order to work out what you have to do. The fourth point I'd make is that regulation should not be a knee-jerk response to the problem of the day. I know that everybody wants to solve problems quickly, and I know often that those who are there in the bureaucracy usually test things carefully and are expected to do it over time. We must make sure that regulation is carefully tested, that it doesn't come about too quickly, because in my experience, it is seldom that regulation gets undone once it is already done. Finally, there is inadvertent regulation. Too often I find regulations are made, but not tested completely in how they might work. If I may use an example, the new legislation relating to wage theft, which is perfectly legitimate and a terrible thing that wages are not being paid properly, prosecute all those on the board and make them personally liable. The fact is, in universities, many of our boards are volunteers. Often I wonder, if you want to have a sleepless night tonight, how are we going to get those volunteers if they're going to have liability like that? We need to check our regulation, and I hope these 5 points help. Regulation should be there to allow an autonomous body, in the case of universities, to thrive, to move towards the stars, and rather than being smothered. Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you. That's a wonderful set of opening remarks. Adrienne, can I pass over to you?
Thanks, Carolyn. So the question that was put to me in terms of the opening comments was, how does TEQSA, as the national regulator, balance our regulatory role with institutional autonomy? So I'd like to take you through the history of regulation very quickly. 3 main points. So the first was, why do we have a national regulator? The Bradley Review recommended the establishment of a national regulator in response to what was then a very fragmented approach to regulation and quality assurance. Back in 2010, when I was first a regulator, it was state-based, and the quality assurance was, for those of you who can remember, was AWQA. And I remember Denise Bradley, who I worked with, being so frustrated with, the recommendations of AWQA had no power, they had no teeth. So there was a great deal of concern at that time about the quality assurance of the sector, particularly in a time of significant public investment. So the Bradley Review, among other things, argued for an independent, standards-based regulation as being key to ensuring quality and integrity of the sector, ensuring the international reputation of the sector, and our previous speaker, ensuring the community of the value of public funding to the sector. So it was all about public accountability and assurance of quality. And I think when we read the accord, we have a number of recommendations which similarly talk about system accountability and assurance. And again, all of the changes in terms of potential changes in terms of funding, greater system diversity. So I think the argument remains about how we have quality assurance through a national regulator. The second part of the regulatory framework is standards-based regulation. The Higher Education Standards Framework, as we know it today, was developed by the inaugural panel in around 2013, 2014. And as a member of that panel, our aim, among other things, was to develop a framework that would provide a resource to the sector, not just a regulatory tool. It's not a set of rules. The framework is not a set of rules. It's a principles-based framework that describes the essential requirements for ensuring the quality of higher education provision and outcomes across a diverse sector. The framework is intended to be as equally useful to a provider as a tool for their own quality assurance as it is to the regulator for its regulatory activity. In its development, the panel was very mindful of the criticism of highly prescribed, standards-based, rule-based regulatory systems that lead to convergence and homogeneity. Thus, the framework was developed to support diversity of approach, acknowledging the varying contexts of all providers. As such, the standard statements are intended to enable and guide good practice, not prescribe a particular type of practice. As the name implies, the Higher Education Standards Framework frames good practice, allowing providers a higher degree of flexibility, and I would actually argue autonomy, in their operations. And thirdly, principles-based regulation and the regulatory ecosystem. So enshrined in the TEQSA Act are the principles of regulation, which are about necessity, risk, and proportionality. From its establishment in 2013 until now, TEQSA has been responding to expectations of the sector, the community, shifts in public policy, as well as its own maturity as a regulator in how it most effectively meets its obligations. Some would argue that we have been too heavy-handed, while others would argue that we have not been doing enough. But for providers, the amount of regulatory oversight in the system that has been set up through the TEQSA Act and the standards is directly proportional to the ability of a provider to demonstrate compliance with the standards, or, as happens in those instances where compliance may be threatened by a particular event or a set of circumstances, the provider's ability to demonstrate a clear awareness of the issues and the planned pathway to rectification or compliance. As foreshadowed last year at our TEQSA conference, we've been reviewing our business processes and our approach to risk assessment to include a greater emphasis on provider self-assurance and the introduction of a more tiered approach to evidence and risk. But in placing greater emphasis on providers' own quality assurance processes and outcomes, it will still be essential for TEQSA to strike that right balance between rigorous and independent regulatory activities, given community expectation, stakeholder expectation on the role of the regulator, while at the same time giving appropriate acknowledgement of providers' own self-assurance maturity. But, as David has just talked about, TEQSA is only one regulator in the ecosystem. As Carolyn commented, regulation of higher education providers can come from many sources, both through state and federal legislation and through public policy. Community expectations, as I said, I think we've seen, particularly in the last 6 months or so, can also place pressure on providers, particularly where there is a view that the sector is falling short of its obligations. In such instances, TEQSA will also need to respond, just as providers do, to ensure ongoing confidence with the sector. And within that regulatory ecosystem, TEQSA acknowledges that we have a role to play in making sure that wherever possible we can collaborate with providers, with other forms of regulation, to make sure that there is mitigation against regulatory burden, but still being very aware of the risks around the sector and how we help the sector manage those risks. So in my closing argument, I would say that from TEQSA's perspective, whole regulatory ecosystem, but from TEQSA's perspective, provider autonomy is very much in the hands of providers. It is dependent on mature and deep systematic self-assurance and sophisticated risk management. To the extent that providers can maintain and evidence this, accountability and trust are served, and these are the social licence necessary for provider autonomy and flexibility.
Thank you, Adrienne. Really helpful to understand the complex environments in which regulators are working, and also I think useful to have a little bit of a look back at that history, because we often are trying to reinvent the same wheel. And now we're looking forward to an international perspective, Alison.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. And I think the first thing I should say is that AdvanceHE is not a regulator at all. We're a development agency, and our role is to help universities to be the best they can be through releasing the potential of your people. So very much about people development. But I did work at our national regulator and funder for 11 years, and I'm a keen observer and I have a keen interest in regulation and autonomy for institutions. What I've been asked to do is to just briefly share the context in the UK at the moment, so that will give you a context for what I might say later on. So the first thing I'd like to say is that education is devolved in the UK. So that means we have different systems in England, Scotland and Wales. So we have the Office for Students in England. The Scottish Funding Council and the Scottish Government are the regulator and funder in Scotland. Scottish students don't pay fees. And we have the new commission, here's a very popular word at the moment, the new Commission for Tertiary Education and Research in Wales, which comes into being in August this year. And they will be responsible for strategy, funding and oversight of HE, FE, which is TAFE, FET here, and sixth form schools. So it's quite an interesting new regime. I think for Scotland and for England, there's similar aims, which is about maintaining high quality and academic standards, protecting student outcomes and ensuring fair access. But if we look at the OFS in particular, because they're a new regulator, they've only been around since 2018, they've just recently had their quinquennial review, and the House of Lords produced a report, the title of which was Must Do Better, the looming crisis facing UK higher or English higher education. And I can tell you a bit about the lessons learned from that later on. But the office, it regulates through statutory duty, so it has the above, but it's also responsible for promoting choice and competition in the sector, promoting equality of opportunity, encouraging innovation, enhancement in teaching, research and knowledge exchange. And it also is there to ensure value for money, for students, for taxpayers, transparency of fees, effective uses of resources, and effective governance. And governance will be a theme, I think, through what I say to you today. It has a range of tools, including the ability to fine institutions, and it has exercised that ability. The UK, like Australia, is considered to have a world-class higher education system, and central to that has always been institutional autonomy, or that's what we believe very strongly. And by that I mean the freedom to, within the law, conduct your day-to-day management in an effective and competent way across 4 key dimensions, being organisational, financial, academic and staffing. This, though, introduces the concept, I think, of earned autonomy, because autonomy certainly does not equal no accountability. So to be responsible and to have that autonomy, universities need to be open and transparent about how they work and accountable for their courses, their programmes, particularly their finances and their operations. So when it comes to regulatory systems in that world, there are a number of choices, and choices do differ. When I worked at HEFGE, our focus and concern was the performance of the system, and that seems to resonate what I'm seeing coming through the Accord. We were very much regulating in partnership with the sector, the idea of co-regulation, and we used soft power much more than any other kind of regulatory controls. We administered £8 billion worth of funding at that time. The OFS was introduced through a new act of Parliament, and their focus is on the student and the markets. Very much a data-driven approach and not a relationship-based approach at all. So there are other regulatory players. We've got an Office of the Independent Adjudicator, the Quality Assurance Agency, the Department, the Research Body. So there are a number of players. And what we do know is that networks of regulators absolutely shape the activities of universities. And it's interesting to hear what's happening in TEQSA, because in my experience, what's really important is the wisdom about the balance between compliance and commitment, but also proportionality, risk, relationship, and being absolutely clear about the purpose of your regulation. Thank you.
Wise words on which to finish the opening comments. We've already got some questions coming in, and some of them speak to issues that have been raised at least briefly by the panellists. And I might start, David, with this one with you, because it picks up on some of the points that you made. We often speak of the need for innovation within the sector, but innovation and high regulation are seldom dance partners. Is a homogeneous higher education sector inevitable without deregulation in the long run?
Look, I think it's a very proper question, and I think in the long run, probably knowing the way Australia works, and obviously Alison can talk about the UK, I think that in the end you'll never make us homogeneous, to be honest. I think that there is always invention. In my experience in life, even though regulation often stultifies, there's always the clever brain that works a way around things. That, by the way, is not a good reason to have regulation in order to get people to work their way around it. So I think the question is aiming at the right point, that over-regulation can produce homogeneity. And do we want homogeneity? In my opinion, definitely not. A small country with 42 universities, all of which are the same, I just don't see how it works.
Did you want to pick up on that, Adrienne?
Yes, I could, because I think what's really interesting about our current regulator is the House of Lords report talked about the level of prescription that we're seeing coming out, the burden of regulation, which is a distraction. But one example of one of the latest regulatory requirements is around spelling and grammar. So this is getting really into the detail. And so you could imagine that could lead to some kind of homogeneity. But maybe it'll come up a bit later on, Carolyn, but I think there is a relationship between autonomy and innovation, and maybe I'll pick that up later on.
No, why don't you pick it up now? 'Cause
Okay.
I think in the end that's what the question is getting to. If we want innovation, if we want diversity, if we want universities to be able to try new things, do we have to be thoughtful about regulation? So let's...
Yeah, I think so, because for us, you know, we spent a lot of time when I was at the regulator thinking, what is our role and how do we stimulate and promote innovation? And this is where we look to university governance. If you look at the role of university governance, it's there to provide assurance, and it provides assurance to your stakeholders, whether they be students, parents, banks, regulators, whoever they are, that this university is well led, it's well managed, it's well governed, it's got good financial controls, it looks after quality. And with that assurance, when that is seen to be operating in practice, it removes regulatory concerns, because when you go in and you inspect or audit your institutions, you see that this is good from your returns. And that in itself, and the banks feel more confident. We saw, you know, banks charging lower interest rates, better covenants, etc. This allows then for the autonomy to flourish, because we can feel confident that it's going to work well. That autonomy itself delivers innovation, £72 billion towards GDP in the UK, but also the solving of, you know, big problems for society. When we see that innovation working in practice, that reassures the assurance process, the governing body, hey, look, this is working. And so you get this virtuous cycle, but it's very much relating to assuring your stakeholders, and it is supported by codes of governance, etc., which is a framework, not a compliance tool. Again, you can comply or explain. But I do think it is possible to establish regulation within that framework and actually look to the governance of universities to really drive that.
Well, Alison's talked about accountability, and one of the questions come through that I might put to you, Adrienne, is about the accountability of regulators. So if the regulators are holding the sector to account and having increasing powers over time, who holds the regulators to account?
Well, let me assure you that TEQSA is held to account. We are part of the Commonwealth regulatory system. We have a range of obligations that we need to report to. You know, if you've ever sat and watched Senate estimates, I think you will know we are held to account. But what I would say is the more powerful way in which we are held to account is our relationship with our providers. So every year we do an annual survey. We get feedback about what's working well, what isn't. We've had a system of guidance notes for years that we've been doing a major review of in order to support the sector better. So there is a formal accountability through the Commonwealth regulatory processes, but I would say that we are very aware of how we respond to the feedback that we get from providers about the work we're doing, you know, where there are inadequacies, where there might be overreach. You know, I read a letter the other day that would suggest perhaps a little bit of overreach. You know, that we hope that we have a relationship with our providers such that we're hearing what you need or what you need guidance in. You know, we take our educative role and our guidance role just as important as our regulatory role. So yes, we are formally accountable, but I would say that, well, from my perspective, what holds us to account is our relationship with you.
And please do continue to send questions in. We do have time for a bit more of a discussion. David, in your opening comments, you talked about perhaps governments being very quick to try and solve problems and regulations, sometimes coming about because of that. There's a question here that notes that regulation often occurs through the deficiency of a few rather than the consequence of systematic deficiencies. How can we guard against this?
Well, that's a very good point. And can I just start by saying I agree with the questioner. If you look at the way our news circles work, the way our democracy works, often an event in one part of Australia can be so acclimatizing that everybody wants to fix it before they've even worked out that it applies in another part of Australia. So I totally agree. How do we get round that? I don't know. I think the answer is probably this. Firstly, maybe regulation isn't required each time there is a problem. And I want to make it clear, I'm not saying that in universities we shouldn't have regulation, nor am I saying that regulation is not sometimes the right thing. But it is, to me, quite knee-jerk quite often that if there is a problem, we'll fix it with regulation. Often, particularly where you've got autonomous bodies, they could fix it themselves. And that perhaps, whether it be naming and shaming or whether it be just talking to the people who are dealing with it, they can fix it without it becoming something that really is a sledgehammer when in fact a little mallet might have done the job.
I think I'd like to add to that. From TEQSA's perspective, like we have a compliance function, and we'll always have to have a compliance function for those situations where there is a threat to the system or bad actors, as we see, often attempting to exploit the system. But, necessity, risk-based proportionality means that, we are also mindful of how we respond to things on that understanding of risk, on the understanding of what does this mean, how are people how is a provider managing the risk, how aware are they of it. So our response in one provider might be quite different to another provider across the same issue, depending upon how sophisticated the provider's self-assurance processes are, how much they understand of their own issues. So, I take the point that there's a perception through legislation and public policy of the sledgehammer to crack a walnut. But I would like to think that in terms of how we operate, that we are aware of that proportionality and risk depending upon what's happening in the provider.
Absolutely.
Well, as someone who's coming up for re-regulation, that's very, very reassuring to hear. Thank you. As we've seen from the Accord and then many of the sessions this morning, there's a real benefit to Australia and to our productivity to bring together vet and higher ed. But the current regulatory arrangements are one of the barriers to that. We have different regulators, we have different regulatory approaches, we have more federal and more state-based. Sorry, Adrienne, probably starts with you again, but others would jump in. How can we better bring together these systems, given that some of those current regulatory barriers? If you had a magic wand, what would you like to do? Bring it all under TEQSA, or?
That's really interesting, again, because I did a little bit of a trip down memory lane in preparing for this, because the Bradley Review actually recommended one tertiary regulator. But then as it came to pass and the thought about the role and purpose of both parts of the tertiary system, the view was that separate regulation would actually be more effective. I have a personal view that tertiary education regulation is not just about TEQSA and ASQA. So there's so much that goes into what drives both of those parts of the sector. We talked about it a little bit this morning in other sessions around, the jurisdictional influences, the incentives, the different public and private relationships, TAFE and where it sits in the vet sector versus the rest of the private providers, the diversity of the vet sector, for example. And some of the risk issues are different. Some of the things we're seeing playing out in terms of international students and immigration are very large in the vet system because the nature of vet makes it slightly vulnerable to that. So I'm not quite sure a robust tertiary system is necessarily going to occur because you bang two regulators together. I think you do need to think very clearly about role and purpose. Again, we've got the skills agenda. The skills agenda is talking a lot about 9 out of 10 will need a tertiary qualification, but within that, some will be higher ed and some are vet. So there's something there that's about role and purpose. In South Australia, I sit on the SA Skills Commission and have a lot to do with apprenticeships and traineeships. There's a lot there that works to make that system work, and it's so important to a range of activities in the economy, and I would hate for that activity to be lost because of a notion that a one-size-fits-all through regulation will create an effective system. Regulations assure the quality of the system. They don't create systems. So the jury's out for me about that, and we'll wait and see.
Excellent. Alison, can I ask you about the role of academics in governance and particularly individual academics, perhaps even more so, academic boards or boards or different institutions call them by different names, but the group of academics who have some oversight of academic matters, what the role do they play in all of this?
Yes, of course. So I think there are two things that spring to mind immediately. So there are some institutions who, as part of their governance arrangements, have academics on the board and representing, whether it's Senate or the academic board, or they've got a staff representation role. And I sit on the court, which is the governing body of the University of St Andrews, and we very much have that, and a variety of academics sit on our boards. But of course, then we've got our Senate or our academic boards who look after the internal quality assurance processes for the university. And I guess it must be 3 or 4 years now that our governing bodies have had responsibility for assuring academic quality. And where that's probably more difficult to do is where some of our governing bodies don't have academics on the board other than the executive. And we've had to do a lot of work to train up particularly our lay members to build the confidence and understand what it means to assure academic governance. And I think there's a lot of more work to be done, I think, in terms of how we deliver on that. So that's a short answer.
Can I just echo that from our perspective in terms of when we work with our providers and the standards framework. The academic and corporate governance sections of the framework are really, really important. If you don't get those right, then a lot of other stuff unravels.
David, be interested in a Chancellor's viewpoint of that, the relationship between the Senate or University Council and then the academic board or what have you.
Can I firstly say I'm a strong believer in a strong and active academic board. I don't know actually how Alison manages it in her role on that court. I can tell you as a long-term Chancellor, I depend on the academic board for certain delegated opportunities. For example, the establishment and disestablishment of the various programs that we do, how they're to be worked out, what are the various pass rates, etc., etc. This is all something that I, as literally a lay educator, someone who's more at home in banking than in fact, in education, in my opinion, is something that must be with the experts. And I think, I know, and obviously TEQSA and Adrienne can talk for themselves, but I think there's an acceptance in Australia that the academic board must be vital and important. The more difficult question is, how do you bring the academic board's prowess to the council? And firstly, as I said, delegations are vital in running a good university. So in our case, we have delegated certain of these aspects to the academic board, and in the 19 years I've been there, they haven't missed a beat. But the second thing is to have some academics actually on the council. Some have suggested you should have a majority. I disagree with that. I think the council of our universities needs to be much more than just a replication of the wonderful academic board. They need to be there, but we need lots of other talents and indeed a microcosm of what's going on in the community.
And David, there's another question of you which is not perhaps strictly related to the topic here, but I suspect many people in the room would like to know the answer given your past life. The Accord has recommended needs-based funding for higher education sector. People would be interested in knowing your views on that.
Well, whoever asked that question must have a very good sense of humour, I suspect. I mean, for me to say I'm not in favour of it would destroy 12 years of waiting and 2 years of doing. But I really think it's a good part of the Accord. And, obviously you didn't ask, but I think the Accord document has a lot in it that's very good. Needs-based funding is, I think, a very good part. To me, it is obvious that we have to be more open in Australia to those from low SES and other disadvantaged areas, and to reward the university because one's prepared to offer early assistance in terms of them coming in, and maybe even assistance in allowing them to live and mature as great university students, I think is very good thinking. So, Carolyn, I'm very much in favour. and it has a beautiful symmetry with certain suggestions for schools, which I hope will be implemented one day properly.
Well, let's take that discussion of the Accord and expand it out a little bit. We've not had a long time to absorb the 400-odd pages, but overall, if the Accord were adopted in full, as Mary urged the government to think about this morning, what would the impact be on autonomy? What concerns might you have? Where might it be a good thing? Who would like to kick off?
I'll have a go.
Have a go.
I'll have a go as an outsider.
Yeah.
And I have to confess, I haven't read the 400 pages. I've read the summary and I've dipped in and out. But and listening to Mary and talking to colleagues here, I think what strikes me as a past kind of regulator is that given the broad umbrella that the Commission and the nature of the Commission, I do think there's a risk of regulatory burden unless some serious thinking is done right at the beginning about what you want your regulatory approaches to be. Most importantly, what's the philosophy, and approach that you wish to take? Because I think where we've gone wrong, if we've got any learning, is not having that relationship with the sector and treating as it's some object out there, an inanimate object. And I think there are important considerations about regulation commensurate with the size of the risk and the reward, empowering third parties or surrogate regulators so that you don't have all this duplication. David, you mentioned this right at the beginning. And I'll leave it there because I get the feeling that you're going to have something to say about
No,
this
no,
too.
I was just smiling, thinking I would have said exactly the same thing. As we've talked about, and I keep saying that the regulatory ecosystem for education, both vet and higher ed, is complex, and it could become more so if we're not alive to the fact. And it's not managed very carefully. I think there are things we need to be doing to harmonise the sources of regulation. In our own work, the number of times we need to meet with, my TEQSA colleagues, not me, TEQSA colleagues need to meet with, Department X and Department Y. Regulation or a driver for a particular style of regulation is often siloed in one portfolio compared with another portfolio. So how do we harmonise that? How do we think much more smartly around, information sharing and data sharing such that we don't end up doing the same thing twice? I'm looking at, not that I can see them very well, but there's another question on the board around, recent new guidelines that came in last year and overlap with other regulatory activities. I think there is work to do to create a more harmonised system in terms of the complexity of regulation that we currently have.
Carolyn, can I make a point? I think that if one looks at the new ATEC, or the Commission, let's call it, it's always a question of what's actually going to happen next. I could see a situation where if ATEC is given enormous powers, put great demands on them in terms of determining pricing and all the things that are on that list that's in the report, and it's manned or womaned by people who are perhaps not as keen on autonomy as some of the people speaking today, I think you could find that it really does become over-regulation. That doesn't mean that I'm against the Commission. I just wanted, and thank you for the opportunity, to say I think the idea of a Commission's a very good one. But I think that the government has to be very careful, if they accept it, how they actually populate it and what they give to it to do. And if I can finally say something, and Adrienne may want to comment on this, I've always liked the idea that TEQSA is actually, autonomous is a bad word, but let's say independent. I don't know how bringing it under the Commission that actually works. And so these are the sort of details. I do not want to be taken to be saying it's a bad suggestion, but I think it is a step a bit away from the clear statement you actually made, Carolyn, that there seems to be an embracing of autonomy, which is wonderful in the report, but there's a question of how this is implemented.
Do you want to comment on that at this point, Adrienne?
I don't think there's enough detail yet to understand the governance structure. I think that, yes, our ability to be a regulator is partly about our independence, and how that governance structure that's described in the Accord report would work in practice. I think I still need to understand more about it.
So a very positive view of ATEC, which is one outlined there, is that it has the potential to pull together all these disparate schemes of regulation, have a much more streamlined, focused effect. But there are lessons from overseas, and Alison, you've looked at many of these systems, and sometimes things start well and go awry, and sometimes things don't start well and go even worse. What lessons could we learn from other systems as we start to set this all up?
No, I think that's a really good point, because if people lament the loss of HEFGI nowadays, because, in those days, we went through processes of what you did, though, which was getting feedback from the people we regulated. We had strategic objectives to reduce regulatory burden, to move from hypothecated or jam jar funding schemes and make life a lot simpler. And we did that, and we delivered on that. 25% reduction over 4 years, another 25% reduction over another 4 years. And we got to a certain point, and I don't want to make it sound like, I'm all sour grapes about the... I'm not, because you get to a point where we wanted a much more diverse system, more players coming in. You needed to do something different, but we seem to have swung a long way on the spectrum to a very prescriptive regime. The other thing that I do at AdvanceHE is I work with a number of countries who were very much command and control. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Egypt also had a very command and control system of higher education, who are working hard and throwing money at creating autonomous institutions. And they are running very fast and accelerating all of it, because they believe in the value of autonomy and the innovation, and they want to get up the league tables, and they want to compete in a global space. So I think the lesson is, when it comes to regulation, if I had one ask of, maybe TEQSA ought to lead this, or somebody, what does enabling regulation look like now? What's enabling regulation look like for the Accord and your future as a country? And spend time working that out together, because I think that will be the key.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And something we've been thinking about, as I said, TEQSA's 10 years old, and the Act at the moment prescribes a certain style of regulation. Like, it's application-based, it's cyclical, every seven years, et cetera, et cetera. And is that effective regulation at the moment? I'm not sure. So we're doing our own thinking around how we become the sort of regulator that we need going forward. How do we become more agile? Where do we put our resources where they're most required? And I think things like the Higher Education Integrity Unit, a unit within TEQSA, which is working so closely with the sector, both on compliance issues, academic cheating, but also on significant developmental issues about assessment and artificial intelligence. And I think that's where we also need to be heading. How do we enable the system, as well as knowing that there'll always be a compliance function as well.
ChatGPT, how do we enable the system to...
Yeah.
David, perhaps starting with you, there are a couple of questions here that I'll pull together, which are really about the fact that many people feel the sector currently is over-regulated, and asks, are we doing a good enough job at pushing back against that level of over-regulation and pushing back, and perhaps is the regulator doing a good enough job of trying to say that the framework that we have is appropriate? But do you want to talk a little bit about whether you think the sector could or should be doing more to push back against over-regulation?
Well, Carolyn, let me start, and this may not be a popular statement, but it's, I believe, I think as a sector, forget regulation for a second, the last few years with governments, plural, has, I think, maybe shown that governments don't like us, but it certainly hasn't shown us as having the ability to be liked. So I just want to put that on the table. And by the way, I should quickly say to a leading Vice-Chancellor, the Chancellors have as much liability on that as the Vice-Chancellors, as do everybody. The second point I would say is, I personally think that the way that we can have peace, etc., is for us to be pushing that we should be autonomous, but we are alive to the fact that we are not omnipotent. And I think that goes in two ways, and I don't know what Alison has experienced in the UK, but I don't understand why, as a leading provider of services to government, a university can't just enter into agreements that are negotiated and may have clauses in them which could well mean that you don't need regulation on many of those aspects. So we could agree, for example, that there will be more low SES coming in under the agreement. There's no need to legislate. No, I'm not suggesting that would be legislated. I'm just saying that is a way of doing it. The second thing I would say is that all of us have to be open and honest about the fact that we are running service industry, which has high demands and a very high standing in terms of people talking about us and so on. And so my feeling is we could do better. My feeling is that we must try to do better, and I hope that that will be met with an open mind by either the governments and or commissions when they're once established.
Well, we're coming towards the end of the session, so I might give each of our panellists an opportunity just for a moment or two of reflection, and we'll go in the opposite order to the one we started in. So, Alison, is there any thoughts that you'd like to share with us? Any advice from across the seas that we should be thinking about?
Well, I think some closing thoughts. I remember sitting in the wonderful Professor Valerie Braithwaite's office in ANU, and she's an, regulatory specialist. I said, what is the purpose of regulation? What is it? She said, to prevent harm. So what harms or detriments do we want to prevent? And then the other thing is, regulation is not some evil. It's there for a purpose. And when it's working well, I think people will say, yeah, that's a fair cop. That needed to be sorted, whether it's fraud or whether it's misbehaviour or whatever it is. And that's when we know it's doing the right thing for us. And I think finally, regulators need to earn their legitimacy, their respect from the regulatees. They need to be transparent and accountable as well.
And on that note,
How do I follow that? Well, I suppose, I was thinking about, the original question, which was about regulation and autonomy, and I just think that, autonomy and accountability, I think, is better than perhaps regulation in this going hand in hand. Like, we expect of our providers to be, leading edge, innovative, they're institutions of higher learning. They contribute to our society in a whole range of ways, and that does come from some of the things that David said about independent, agile, strategic decision, all of those good things that we see in our providers. But to what purpose? And I think that's where accountability comes in. We're public entities, being open and transparent, creating trust and confidence and value, so that governments, the public, are willing to invest in that. And I see TEQSA as a partnership in that virtuous circle, as you described.
Thank you. David.
Thank you. I would simply say, in view of what I've already said, firstly, I love this sector. It's not been where I have made my living. It's one that I chose to be in. It's a sector that is absolutely full of stars and wonderful people. And I would just urge, as we lurch into the most marvellous period started by this excellent document that we received on Sunday, let's remove some of the bad apples through regulation, but not seek to smother the rest of the thousands of apples that are there and which are delicious and going to make Australia very famous.
So we've had some really thoughtful discussion today about an important topic, and it's not one to which there are easy answers. One of the issues that I certainly find as a Vice-Chancellor is that there's very little regulatory overreach that comes from malice. It's not that it never happens, but it rarely does. And any individual piece of regulation, you can look at and you can see the point behind it. You can understand the harm that they're trying to combat. The difficulty becomes the cumulative, sometimes contradictory aims of different regulation from different regulators at different levels of government, and how we turn that into something more systematic that has the benefits of regulation that our panellists, I think, have articulated really well, but doesn't have the detriment of having a sector which is increasingly absorbing resources into compliance rather than the core business of teaching and learning and research and contributing to our country. I think that the Accord really is trying to come up with some ways of grappling with how to do that, but there's going to be a really important implementation moment in coming weeks and months as we stop and think about how we try and design systems from the start so that they have the benefits of good regulation without the detriments of overly incoherent or overreaching regulation. It's been a pleasure to have the three experts we've had with us today. Please join with me in thanking them.